What would you do if you sold your greatest invention to a fraud just to save your dying wife? Weston Pry did exactly that. He watched a billionaire take credit for his genius for 10 years while he swept the floors. But tonight, the machines are failing, and the genius CEO has no idea how to stop the countdown. The hospital is suffocating, and the only fix is an 8-page manual written by a man they called a security risk. This is the story of the brass heart. The glass facade of the Ascension Medical Center shimmered like a polished diamond against the smoggy twilight of the city, a cathedral of modern medicine that promised immortality to those who could afford the premium. Inside, the air was filtered to a surgical purity, circulating through a labyrinth of vents managed by the Aegis Core, the world's most sophisticated environmental AI. While the billionaire elite and world-class surgeons walked the plush carpets of the upper floors, Weston Pry existed in the humid, thrumming veins of the sub-basement. He was a man of shadows and silence, his presence marked only by the rhythmic clank of his wrench and the heavy tread of his steel-toed boots. At 34, Weston carried the weight of a man twice his age, his eyes perpetually tired and his hands permanently stained with the industrial oils of the machinery he tended. To the hospital staff, he was merely a ghost in a Navy jumpsuit, a necessary but invisible component of the building's infrastructure. But to Weston, the hospital was a living, breathing creature, and he was the only one who truly understood the cadence of its mechanical heart. Every evening, before his graveyard shift began, Weston would sit in his cramped apartment and watch his 7-year-old daughter, Nell, sleep. Her breathing was steady, a precious sound that Weston never took for granted. It was the memory of a different kind of breathing, labored, wheezing, and eventually failing, that drove him. Years ago, when his wife Fen had been dying of a rare respiratory condition, Weston had been a rising star in experimental engineering. He had designed the Aegis Core not for profit, but to create a perfect environment for patients like her. But the clinical trials were expensive and the debt had mounted until he was drowning. Desperate to keep Fen in the high-tech ICU for just a few more weeks, he had made the deal with the devil. He had sold the patent rights and the source code of his life's work to Dr. Burke Hollson, a man who possessed a surgeon's hands but a vulture's soul. Burke had stripped Weston's name from the blueprints, rebranded the tech as his own, and parlayed it into a billion-dollar empire. Weston had been left with nothing but a non-disclosure agreement and a low-level technician in the very building he had envisioned. Tonight, the sub-basement felt different. As Weston moved through the narrow corridors of Sector 4, the usual low-frequency hum of the pneumatic regulators sounded sharp, almost frantic. He pressed his palm against a primary steam line, feeling a vibration that shouldn't have been there. It was a thermal feedback loop, a ghost in the machine that he had warned about during the initial design phase a decade ago. The AI was overcalculating the cooling needs of the server rooms and starving the patient wards of stabilized oxygen. It was a subtle flaw, a mathematical hiccup that would be invisible to anyone looking at a digital dashboard. But to a man who had built the logic from scratch, it was as loud as a scream. Weston pulled his tablet from his belt, his fingers dancing over a terminal interface that only he knew how to access. He watched the pressure curves spike and dip with erratic violence. The system was struggling to maintain the perfect environment that Avery Colt, the hospital's formidable CEO, demanded for her high-profile board meeting tomorrow. Upstairs, Avery Colt was likely looking out of her floor-to-ceiling windows, oblivious to the fact that the very floor beneath her was beginning to groan under the strain of its own ambition. Weston knew he should stay silent. His contract strictly forbade him from touching the core logic. But as he looked at the pressure gauge, he didn't see numbers. He saw the faces of the people in the recovery wing. He saw Nell's face. He couldn't let the lungs of this building fail, even if the world thought a man like Burke Hollson was the one keeping them inflated. With a heavy sigh, Weston sat down on an upturned plastic crate, surrounded by the deafening roar of the turbines, and began to document the anomaly. He knew that reporting this to Burke would be like handing a death sentence to his own career, but the machine was crying out for help, and Weston Pry was the only one who knew how to listen. He was the secret architect of this crystal tower, a king in a jumpsuit, preparing to fight a battle that no one would ever know he fought. As the clock struck midnight, the Aegis Core let out a low metallic moan, and Weston began to type, his heart beating in sync with the struggling brass heart of the hospital. The morning sun had barely begun to bleed through the smog of the city when Weston stood outside the mahogany double doors of the chief medical officer's suite, clutching a manila folder that felt as heavy as lead. Inside the office, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the sterile, artificial grease of the very system Weston was trying to save. Dr. Burke Hollson sat behind a desk carved from a single piece of obsidian, looking every bit the visionary the media claimed him to be. He didn't look up as Weston entered, his eyes fixed on a glowing holographic projection of the hospital's quarterly efficiency ratings. For 3 minutes, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic hiss of the vents, a sound that, to Weston's trained ears, now carried a distinct, jagged edge. When Burke finally looked up, his expression wasn't one of professional curiosity, but of profound irritation. He viewed Weston not as a colleague or even a skilled employee, but as a biological error in his pristine environment, a smudge of grease on a white lab coat. Weston didn't wait for an invitation. He laid the thermal feedback reports on the desk, pointing to the cascading red lines that indicated a looming failure in the Aegis Core's logic. He explained, in a voice kept steady by sheer force of will, that the pressure valves were showing signs of latency fatigue, and that if the cooling cycle wasn't manually overridden within the next 12 hours, the entire north wing's ventilation would lock down to prevent a localized explosion, effectively suffocating the recovery wards. Burke's reaction was a slow, chilling smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He picked up the report with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated, and skimmed the pages with a performative boredom. He didn't see the complex algorithms or the physical reality of the vibrating pipes. He only saw a threat to the narrative he had spent years constructing. To acknowledge Weston's warning was to acknowledge Weston's expertise, and to acknowledge that expertise was to admit that the Hollson patent was built on a foundation of stolen genius. With a flick of his wrist, Burke tossed the folder into a shredder beside his desk, the mechanical growl of the machine devouring Weston's 3 nights of labor in a matter of seconds. He then stood up, smoothing his designer suit, and walked toward the window that overlooked the city. He told Weston that his primitive understanding of the system was outdated, that the AI was self-correcting, and that these ghost errors were merely the result of a disgruntled mechanic looking for relevance. But the dismissal didn't stop at words. Burke turned back, his voice dropping to a low, predatory whisper, informing Weston that his unauthorized probing into the core's encryption was a direct violation of his non-disclosure agreement. By the time the sentence was finished, 2 security guards had appeared at the door. Burke didn't just fire him, he systematically erased him, ordering the guards to escort the HVAC technician from the premises and to revoke his digital credentials immediately. The walk through the hospital lobby felt like a funeral procession for a man who wasn't yet dead. Weston kept his head down, his jaw tight as he felt the stares of the staff, people he'd worked alongside for years, now looking at him like a common criminal. He was led through the loading docks, the air turning from the hospital's filtered chill to the humid, oppressive heat of the city streets. The guards didn't say a word as they watched him step onto the cracked pavement, the heavy security gates sliding shut with a final metallic thud that echoed in his chest. In his hand, he clutched a small, battered plastic bag containing the few personal items he'd kept in his locker, a spare wrench, a photo of Fen, and his daughter's broken tablet. He felt a sudden sharp pang of vertigo as the sheer scale of his situation hit him. He was a single father with no income, blacklisted by the most powerful medical corporation in the country, and he carried the terrifying knowledge that hundreds of lives were currently tethered to a machine that was slowly, invisibly strangling itself. He looked up at the towering glass spire of the Ascension Medical Center, the sun reflecting off its surface with a blinding, indifferent glare. Burke believed he had buried the secret by burying the man, but as Weston turned away toward the subway, he felt a cold, hard clarity settling over him. He wasn't just a mechanic, and he wasn't just a victim. He was the only person on the planet who knew the brass heart of that building had a murmur, and as the first faint tremor of a pressure spike vibrated through the soles of his boots, he knew the countdown had already begun. The silence in Weston's apartment at 2 in the morning was not a peaceful one. It was an oppressive, heavy vacuum that seemed to amplify the frantic ticking of the clock on the wall and the soft, shallow breaths of Nell sleeping in the next room. The small flat felt smaller than ever, a claustrophobic box of peeling wallpaper and shadows that felt like they were closing in on him. Weston sat at the scarred wooden kitchen table, the dim glow of a single overhead bulb casting long skeletal shadows across the surface. In front of him lay the broken tablet he had carried out of the hospital like a relic of a lost life. His mind was a storm of mechanical schematics and thermal gradients, a chaotic replay of the red lines he had seen on the monitors before Burke had erased his existence. He knew with a terrifying mathematical certainty that the feedback loop in the Aegis Core was no longer a theoretical risk, it was a physical inevitability. Somewhere across the city, inside the gleaming glass ribs of the Ascension Medical Center, the pressure was mounting in the primary pneumatic nodes, the AI blindly rerouting power to keep the lights bright and the servers cool while the life support vents in the pediatric and intensive care units began to lose their rhythm. He could almost feel the vibration of the failing valves through the floorboards, a phantom limb sensation that tied his soul to the machine he had birthed. The logical part of his brain, the part that had been beaten down by years of poverty and corporate silencing, told him to let it go. Burke had stolen his name, the hospital had discarded his loyalty, and the city didn't even know he existed. Why should he risk his freedom to save a system that had been used to build a billionaire's throne? He looked at the stack of past due notices on the counter and the empty space where his steady paycheck used to be. But then his gaze drifted to the doorway of Nell's room. He thought of the patients in those beds, people who were just like Fenn had been, vulnerable and entirely dependent on the integrity of the air they breathed. They didn't know that their lives were being gambled on a CMO's ego or a corrupted algorithm. To Weston, a machine was more than steel and code. It was a promise made by the creator to the user. If the Aegis Core failed, it wasn't just a technical glitch, it was a betrayal of that sacred promise. He realized then that he couldn't live with the silence if that silence was eventually broken by the news of a catastrophic failure he could have prevented. Without a word, he pushed aside the broken tablet and pulled a stack of Nell's drawing paper and a handful of architectural pens toward him. For the next 4 hours, the world outside ceased to exist. Weston's hand moved with a fluid, haunting precision, his fingers operating on a muscle memory that bypassed his exhaustion. He wasn't just drawing, he was performing an exorcism. He charted the labyrinthine network of the hospital's substructures, mapping out the bypasses and the manual override sequences that he had originally designed as a safety net, the very safety net Burke had deleted from the official manuals to make the system seem invincible. He wrote out the hex code strings for the emergency patch, his handwriting small and cramped, but perfectly legible. He detailed how to vent the excess thermal energy into the secondary cooling towers without triggering a building-wide lockdown. It was an exhaustive 8-page manual for a miracle, written by a man who had no right to care. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep over the city skyline, Weston finished the final diagram. He didn't sign it with his name. He didn't need the credit anymore. He simply folded the papers into a thick envelope and wrote a single humble directive on the front. He knew he couldn't upload it, and he knew he couldn't walk back through the front doors, but he knew a night courier who didn't ask questions about who sent what, as long as the delivery was paid for. As he walked to the 24-hour kiosk down the street, the cold morning air biting at his lungs, Weston felt a strange, hollow peace. He had sent his heart back into the lion's den, not for money or for fame, but because the world was broken, and for one night, he was the only one who knew how to fix it. He dropped the envelope into the slot and walked away, a ghost returning to the shadows. leaving the fate of the brass heart in the hands of a woman who didn't even know his name. Inside the command center of the Ascension Medical Center, the atmosphere had shifted from clinical efficiency to a state of suppressed panic that tasted like ozone and cold sweat. Avery Colt stood at the center of the room, her silhouette framed by a massive wraparound display of glowing data points that were rapidly turning from amber to a violent pulsing red. The Aegis Core, her billion-dollar pride, was no longer singing its usual low-frequency lullaby. Instead, a high-pitched metallic whine was vibrating through the floorboards, a sound that seemed to set everyone's teeth on edge. On the monitors, the oxygen saturation levels in the North Recovery Wing were dropping by a fraction of a percent every minute, while the temperature in the server rooms was climbing to critical levels. Avery turned to her lead engineers, men with Ivy League degrees and six-figure salaries, only to find them staring at their terminals with expressions of paralyzed confusion. They were interface specialists, trained to manage the software surface, but the monster currently thrashing in the basement was deep in the primal code, a territory they didn't have the maps to navigate. Every time they tried to force a reboot, the system's smart logic interpreted the move as a cyber attack and locked the emergency vents even tighter, turning the hospital's most expensive ward into a pressurized, airless greenhouse. In the corner of the room, Dr. Burke Hollson was pacing like a caged animal, his face a ghostly shade of gray that clashed with the pristine white of his lab coat. Every few seconds, he would bark out an order that made less and less sense, demanding they override the override or cut the power, as if he were trying to perform surgery with a sledgehammer. Avery watched him with a growing sense of icy detachment. She had built her empire by reading people as much as balance sheets, and she could see the exact moment when Burke's confidence shattered. He wasn't acting like the man who had invented the most complex pneumatic system in history. He was acting like a man who had walked into a cockpit and realized he didn't know which lever controlled the landing gear. When she demanded a manual bypass code for the central node, Burke stammered, citing security protocols and proprietary encryption that even he couldn't access in a crisis. It was a lie, and they both knew it. The brilliance he had claimed for a decade was a hollow shell, a stolen suit of armor that was now collapsing under its own weight. Avery pushed past him, her heels clicking sharply against the glass floor, and seized a terminal herself. She didn't look at the flashy UI. She dove into the raw system logs, searching for the ghost that Burke was so desperate to hide. Deep in the root directory, buried under layers of Hollson's branding and corporate watermarks, Avery found a string of legacy code that didn't match the rest of the architecture. It was elegant, poetic, and utterly different from the clumsy, bloated updates Burke's team had layered over it. As the hospital's alarms began to blare a low, mournful sound that signaled the start of a total system lockdown, Avery's fingers flew across the keyboard. She bypassed the glossy dashboard and dug into the original blueprints of the pneumatic regulators. There, hidden in the digital bedrock of the Aegis Core, she saw it. A small, indelible watermark stamped into the margin of the primary logic gates. It wasn't a corporate logo or a trademark. It was 3 simple letters, WKP. A memory flashed in her mind. A man in a navy jumpsuit she had passed in the sub-basement just days ago. A man with grease on his hands and eyes that looked like they had seen the birth of the stars. She remembered the name on the badge, Weston Pry. She realized with a jolt of visceral anger that the technician she had seen escorted out of the building like a thief was the very man whose genius was currently the only thing holding the hospital together. The crisis reached its peak as the server room's fire suppression system armed itself, a move that would dump suffocating halon gas into the wards if the heat wasn't vented within minutes. The engineering team had completely lost control. The AI was now in a self-preservation loop, shutting down patient care to save its own hardware. Burke was shouting at a security guard to find the WKP file and delete it, his panic finally stripping away the last of his professional facade. But Avery wasn't listening to him anymore. She stood still amidst the chaos, her eyes fixed on the WKP watermark as the building groaned, a sound like a great brass heart beginning to crack. She realized that she had been worshipping a fraud while the architect had been sweeping the floors. Just as she prepared to order a total evacuation, a junior clerk burst into the command center, clutching a thick, rain-drenched envelope that had just been delivered by a night courier. He handed it to Avery, stammering that it was addressed to the director and marked Emergency Fix. Avery tore it open, her eyes widening as she saw 8 pages of hand-drawn schematics, the missing map to the labyrinth. The ink was fresh, the logic was flawless, and the WKP stamp was on every page. The ghost had returned to save his machine, and Avery Colt realized that the man the world had ignored was the only one who could stop the clock. The atmosphere in the command center shifted from chaotic noise to a sharp, breathless focus as Avery Colt spread the hand-drawn schematics across the central glass console, physically covering the flickering error messages with Weston's precise ink drawings. The contrast was jarring. Where the digital screen showed a mess of corrupted logic, the vellum pages offered a masterclass in mechanical clarity. Avery didn't wait for the committee's approval or Burke's stammering protests. She recognized the WKP watermark from the root directory and realized these pages were the Rosetta Stone for the dying machine. With a commanding gesture, she ordered the lead technicians to abandon their digital overrides and follow the manual bypass sequence Weston had charted. Burke Hollson made a desperate final attempt to intervene, lunging toward the papers and claiming they were unverified documents from a disgruntled ex-employee that would surely cause a total system explosion. Avery didn't even look at him. She simply signaled the security detail, and for the first time in the hospital's history, the chief medical officer was physically removed from his own command center. The silence that followed his departure was filled only by the ominous, high-pitched scream of the failing turbines, a sound that Avery knew signaled the final seconds of the Aegis Core stability. Following Weston's exhaustive instructions, Avery navigated the terminal into a maintenance-only sublevel of the code that had been hidden behind Burke's proprietary firewalls. Her fingers moved with a rhythmic intensity, inputting the hex code strings Weston had scrawled in the margins of page 4. As she entered the final command, a heavy mechanical thud vibrated through the entire building, the sound of the primary pressure nodes finally disengaging from their lethal feedback loop. On the monitors, the violent red pulses began to fade, replaced by a steady, calming blue. The oxygen saturation levels in the pediatric ward stopped their terrifying descent and began to climb, and the temperature in the server rooms plummeted as the redirected thermal energy was vented safely into the cooling towers. The building seemed to let out a massive collective sigh, the lungs of the hospital returning to the steady, rhythmic hiss-thrum that Weston had always maintained. The engineers, who moments ago were paralyzed by the AI's complexity, looked at the hand-drawn pages with a sense of awe, realizing that the HVAC guy had built a failsafe more sophisticated than the AI itself. Avery stood back, her heart hammering against her ribs, and looked at the single, humble note Weston had attached, just because it needs to be fixed. The crisis had been averted, but the revelation left a cold, simmering anger in Avery's chest. She realized that every life saved in the last 10 minutes was owed to a man she had allowed to be humiliated and discarded. She spent the next hour in the archives, not looking at the current Hollson patents, but digging into the acquisition records from a decade ago. There, buried in the legal fine print of a desperate medical debt settlement, she found the original, unredacted contract signed by Weston Pry. It was a document of pure sacrifice, a man selling the soul of his genius to buy a few more breaths for a dying woman. She saw the dates, the amounts, and the systematic way Burke had used Weston's grief to steal a billion-dollar legacy. The brilliance of the Aegis Core hadn't been an evolution of medical science led by a famous surgeon. It was the love letter of a grieving husband transformed into a corporate commodity. Every innovation Burke had claimed was merely a polished version of the blueprints now sitting on her desk, stained with the rain and ink of a man who worked the graveyard shift. As the sun began to rise, casting long, golden shadows across the now stable command center, Avery didn't call a press conference or go to sleep. Instead, she gathered the original patents, the intercepted reports Burke had shredded, and the midnight schematics that had saved the hospital. She called an emergency, closed-door meeting of the board of directors, her voice a calm but lethal edge as she laid out the evidence of a decade-long fraud. By the time the meeting adjourned, Burke Hollson's name was being scrubbed from the building's digital directories, and his legal team was being notified of a massive criminal fraud investigation. But for Avery, the work wasn't finished. She walked out of the glass and steel cathedral and into the humid morning air of the city, clutching the envelope. She didn't summon her usual driver. Instead, she hailed a taxi and gave the driver an address in a part of the city she had never visited, a place of narrow streets and peeling wallpaper. She knew that the brass heart of her hospital was beating again, but she also knew that the man who had given it life was sitting in a small apartment, probably fixing a broken toy for his daughter, expecting nothing but the silence of another day. It was time, she decided, for the ghost to finally be seen. The black SUVs that lined the narrow, cracked street of Weston's neighborhood looked like obsidian shards against the weathered brick of the tenement buildings. Avery Colt stepped out of the lead vehicle, her sharp, tailored suit a stark contrast to the rusted fire escapes and the smell of damp asphalt. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs, her heels echoing a steady, purposeful rhythm that mirrored the new, healthy beat of the hospital's pneumatic core. When the door opened, she found Weston Pry sitting at his small kitchen table, the morning light catching the silver in his hair. He wasn't surprised to see her. He merely looked tired, his eyes reflecting a quiet peace that comes from doing the right thing for no reward. On the table between them sat the 8th page of his schematics and a half-repaired clockwork bird. Avery didn't start with small talk or corporate platitudes. She laid a thick, gold-embossed folder on the scarred wood of his table. It contained a new contract, drafted in the frantic hours of the dawn, which didn't just offer him a job, it restored his legal ownership of every patent Burke had stolen. She told him, her voice thick with an uncharacteristic flicker of emotion, that the Aegis Core had been renamed the Pry Aegis System by a unanimous board vote, and that Dr. Burke Hollson was currently being escorted out of the hospital in handcuffs. Weston didn't reach for the pen immediately. He looked at the window, toward the distant silhouette of the Ascension Medical Center, the glass spire he had built with his mind and maintained with his hands. He asked her if the patients were safe, and when Avery nodded, a small, genuine smile finally broke through his weary exterior. Avery explained that she wasn't just there to hire a chief technology officer. She was there to ask for a partnership. She admitted that she had built an empire on the what and the how much, but she had ignored the how and the who. She promised that under his leadership, the hospital would no longer be a cathedral for the elite, but a sanctuary for anyone who needed to breathe, just as he had originally intended when he first put pen to paper for Fenn. The brass heart of the city would finally have a soul to match its machinery. Weston looked at the contract and then at the room where Nell was just beginning to wake up, her small voice calling for her father. For the first time in a decade, the suffocating weight of debt and anonymity evaporated, replaced by the clear, filtered air of a future he had actually earned. The transition was swift and seismic. Within a month, the ghost in the machine had become the face of a new era in medical engineering. Weston didn't move into Burke's obsidian-themed office. Instead, he had the walls knocked down to create an open-plan laboratory in the heart of the sub-basement, where he could still hear the hum of the turbines and stay close to the men and women who actually turned the wrenches. He remained a man of few words, preferring the language of pressure gradients and thermal cycles, but his presence transformed the hospital's culture from one of competitive ego to one of collective care. Avery stayed by his side, the billionaire strategist and the brilliant engineer forming an unlikely, formidable alliance that began to disrupt the entire industry. They didn't just fix the Ascension Center, they began designing modular, low-cost versions of the pneumatic life support systems to be shipped to clinics in parts of the world that had never seen a working ventilator. The Pry legacy was no longer a secret buried in a drawer. It was a global standard for excellence and empathy. The story reached its true conclusion on a quiet Sunday afternoon, long after the scandal of Dr. Burke Hollson had faded from the headlines. Weston stood on the hospital's rooftop garden with Nell, the city spread out beneath them like a sprawling, mechanical map. He handed her the clockwork bird he had finally fixed finishing, a small, delicate creature of brass and silver. When she wound the key, the bird didn't just chirp, its wings moved with a perfect pneumatic fluidity, a miniature version of the massive system keeping thousands of people alive in the floors below them. Avery joined them, looking out at the skyline with a sense of fulfillment that no quarterly report had ever provided. She realized that the brass heart wasn't just the machine in the basement, it was the man standing next to her, a father who had been willing to be forgotten so that others could live. As the sun set, bathing the glass tower in a warm golden glow, the little bird took a phantom flight in Nell's hands. The lungs of the city were steady, the inventor's name was etched in stone, and for Weston Pry, the long, cold night of the graveyard shift was finally over. The heart was restored, and for the first time in his life, Weston could breathe as easily as the world he had saved.